Okay, so I want to welcome everyone. Today is May 9th, 2020, and we're going to engage in the next Bible study here. And just, for those of you who have not been here before, we covered different topics and different items when we're doing Bible studies. Sometimes we'll cover a specific topic, like recently we covered anxiety, and another time we covered grief. Last week we covered the kingdom of Yahweh, and other times we will cover something more kind of a mixed message, sermon / Bible study, in which I'll do kind of a combination of the two. And sometimes we'll do what I'm going to do today, which is probably one of my favorite things to do, which is, in my opinion, really in the purest sense of the word, Bible study, which is when you actually take a section of the Bible and actually go through it. So what I want to do today, and I do that rather frequently, just because I enjoy it, and we're able to go verse by verse and just kind of learn what the scriptures say in different books. So today I want to at least start, there's no way we're going to finish this, but I want to at least start taking a look at 1 Thessalonians. It's a book that doesn't, and there's no particular rhyme or reason why I'm choosing 1 Thessalonians, except maybe that it's somewhat short, right? And so we can get through some of it and get a good comprehensive sense of it. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I had gone a little bit through the book of Philippians, and we never followed up on that. And perhaps we'll do that someday. But I want to stick to 1 Thessalonians and maybe give you an overview, and then see if we can at least go through the first chapter. And then if we have time to start into the second chapter, we'll do that. And then maybe next week I'll finish off the book and go through the rest of it if we have the time. But we're not going to be able to spend any really great detail. If I really wanted to cover this, it would probably take me about a month to get through it, verse by verse, and corresponding different scriptures and cross-referencing, etc. But we'll do what we can in the next today and then next week. So one thing I always like to do whenever we start a new book is I like to go through the entire book. So we're going to read through all the 1 Thessalonians, which is just a short 5 chapters, so that we can get a comprehensive overview of the whole chapter. And then I'll take you through some introductory material, and then we'll get into chapter 1. And if we have time, we'll go through chapter 2. Okay? All right, so let's begin with 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. Paul, Silas, and Timothy, to the assembly of the Thessalonians in Yahweh the Father and the Master Yahshua Messiah, grace and peace to you. We always thank Yahweh for all of you and continually mention you in our prayers. We remember before our Elohim and Father your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Master Yahshua Messiah. For we know, brothers and sisters, loved by Yahweh, that he has chosen you, because our evangel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit, and deep conviction. You know how we lived among you for your sake. You became imitators of us and of the Master, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. And so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. Yahweh's message rang out from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in Yahweh has become known everywhere. Therefore, we do not need to say anything about it, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us. They tell how you turned to Yahweh from idols to serve the living and true Elohim, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Yahshua, who rescues us from the coming wrath. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our Elohim, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by Yahweh to be entrusted with the evangel. We're not trying to please people, but Yahweh, who tests our hearts. You know we never use flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. Yahweh's our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Messiah, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the evangel of Elohim, the good news, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the evangel of Elohim to you. You are witnesses, and so is Elohim, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of Yahweh, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. And we also thank Yahweh continually, because when you received the word of Yahweh, which you heard from us, you accepted it not as a human word, but as it actually is, the word of Yahweh, which is indeed at work in you who believe. For you, brothers and sisters, became imitators of Yahweh's assemblies in Judea, which are in Messiah Yahshua. You suffered from your own people the same things those assemblies suffered from the Jews who killed the Master Yahshua and the prophets, and also drove us out. They displease Yahweh and are hostile to everyone in their effort to keep us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved. In this way, they always heap up their sins to the limit. The wrath of Yahweh has come upon them at last. But brothers and sisters, when we were orphaned by being separated from you for a short time, in person, not in thought, out of our intense longing, we made every effort to see you. For we wanted to come to you. Certainly I, Paul, did again and again, but Satan blocked our way. For what is our hope, or our joy, or the crown in which we will glory in the presence of our sovereign Yahshua when he comes? Is it not you? Indeed, you are our glory and joy. So when we could stand it no longer, we thought it best to be left by ourselves in Athens. We sent Timothy, who is our brother and co-worker in Yahweh's service, in spreading the evangel of Messiah, to strengthen and encourage you in the faith, so that no one would be unsettled by these trials. For you know quite well that we are destined for them. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted. And it turned out that way, as you well know. For this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that in some way the tempter had tempted you, and that our labors might have been in vain. But Timothy has just now come to us from you, and has brought good news about your faith and love. He has told us that you always have pleasant memories of us, and that you long to see us, just as we also long to see you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in all our distress and persecution, we were encouraged about you because of your faith. For now we really live, since you are standing firm in Yahweh. How can we thank Yahweh enough for you in return for all the joy we have in the presence of our Elohim because of you? Night and day we pray most earnestly that we may see you again and supply what is lacking in your faith. Now may our Elohim and Father himself and our sovereign Yahshua clear the way for us to come to you. May Yahweh make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. May he strengthen your hearts so that you will be blameless and holy in the presence of our Elohim and Father when our sovereign Yahshua comes with all his holy ones. As for other matters, brothers and sisters, we instructed you how to live in order to please Yahweh, as in fact you are living. Now we ask you and urge you in the sovereign Yahshua to do this more and more. For you know what instructions we gave you by the authority of the Master Yahshua. It is Yahweh's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know Elohim, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. Yahweh will punish all those who commit such sins, as we told you and warned you before. For Elohim did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. Therefore, anyone who rejects this instruction does not reject a human being, but Yahweh, the very Elohim who gives you his Holy Spirit. Now, about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, but you yourselves have been taught by Yahweh to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of Yahweh's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Yahshua died and rose again, and so we believe that Yahweh will bring with Yahshua those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Master's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Master, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Master himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of Yahweh, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Master in the air. And so we will be with the Master forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Now, brothers and sisters, about times and dates we do not need to write to you. You know very well that the day of the Master will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are all children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet. For Yahweh did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our sovereign Yahshua Messiah. He died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. Now we ask you, brothers and sisters, to acknowledge those who work hard among you, who care for you in Yahweh, and who admonish you. Hold them in the highest regard and love because of their work. Live in peace with each other. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive. Encourage the disheartened. Help the weak. Be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is Yahweh's will for you in Messiah Yahshua. Do not quench the spirit. Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all. Hold on to what is good. Reject every kind of evil. May Elohim himself, the Elohim of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. Brothers and sisters, pray for us. Greet all Yahweh's people with a holy kiss. I charge you before the Master to have this letter read to all the brothers and sisters. The grace of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah be with you. It's a nice little letter. This is a letter that encompasses a lot of different things, and it's actually written to a very young assembly. So it gives us a good glimpse of how Paul treated assemblies that he had recently established and how he dealt with particular issues that came up. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because it is likely that 1 Thessalonians is, and most scholars are agreed on this, it is probably the earliest of the New Testament writings. It was written probably around 50, 51 Common Era, and this would have been, as I said, one of the earliest. Paul would have written it while he was at Corinth, along with Silas, or Silvanus is the full version of his name. And then Paul and Silvanus were joined by Timothy at some point. Timothy had been sent to find out how the Thessalonians were doing. So we're going to talk about all that. I'm just kind of giving you an overview, but you can see immediately throughout the letter a bunch of different things that are really important to point out. So one of the things that remember, whenever you're looking at any biblical book, right, and among different things that I'll talk about, we'll certainly talk about the content, but I also like to teach you how to learn, right? Whenever you're reading any biblical book, you always want to read it straight through so that you can get an overall sense, because what I find, what I have found in my years in ministry is that we get in trouble when we isolate passages of scripture, right? When what you typically hear in preaching, in studies, and in different teachings, you hear people take small passages of scripture, little sections, little segments. And if you have someone who is not very well versed in scripture, or worse, someone who's trying to promote an agenda in terms of a doctrinal agenda, what you'll find is that it can be very easy for them to put a bunch of scriptures together and piece them together in such a way that they communicate a message that they were never intended to convey in the first place. So I don't say that so that you could be looking at anyone who preaches in a cynical way, trying to wonder where they're trying to mislead you. That's not my point at all. But what I am saying is this: each of us as believers with scriptures in our hands has a responsibility to learn the scriptures to the extent that we can ourselves, like the Bereans that you find in the book of Acts, so that we're not led astray by anyone at any point, so that we have an understanding of context and what these books are saying. And this is why the reason why I go through these books, so that we can look at the entire context and learn, okay, this is what Paul was trying to say, or this is what Timothy was trying to say, and this was the main theme of this book, or this is the main teaching of that book, so that we don't ever find ourselves in a situation where someone comes and lifts something out of a book and says, oh, this is what this means, or spiritualizes a particular passage so that they could say, okay, this is what we're trying to teach, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the original intent of that writing. And if it wasn't something that meant something to that group of people, it can never mean that to a group of people in the future, including in the present day. So whenever you study scriptures, one of the first things you want to do is you want to get the overall context of the book. Even if we're talking about something like the book of Isaiah, which is one of the largest, meatiest things you're going to see, you want to read through the whole thing so that you can get an overview, and then you begin to look at it in its respective parts so that you can break it down and analyze it in such a way that you can get a good sense of the individual sections, okay? So if you look through the book of 1 Thessalonians, you'll see different themes, right? You'll see the theme, for example, of encouragement. How many times did you hear him say, encourage one another, right? A new assembly needs encouragement, right? These are folks who are living in difficult times. He talks also in a couple of sections about how they were trying to encourage them because of what they were going through. He talks about their persecution, like in 3 verse 4. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted. And he also describes how they also are going through difficult times. And I don't remember all the different sections here, but he's the indication is that they're undergoing persecution from people. So he's trying to get them into a frame of mind where, being new in the faith, that they're not going to allow themselves to be shaken from the faith because of the persecution that they were receiving. He alludes to that, for example, when he's talking about, in chapter 2, verse 14, he says, you suffered from your own people the same things those assemblies suffered from the Jews who killed the master Yahshua and the prophets and also drove us out. So they were going through some persecution, and he was trying to help them, to encourage them. And, and as we look at these things, obviously we want to see first and foremost, right? This is the proper way to interpret scripture. First and foremost, always, always, always. First and foremost, you want to see what that particular book meant, or those writings meant to the people to whom it was written, always. And I emphasize that a lot, because when you don't do that and you say, well, this is meant for us, and you don't take into account the original context, that's a recipe for false teachings. And that's a recipe for cultists to get into the way and to try to, create teachings and doctrines that have nothing to do with what the text is trying to show. So encouragement is a big thing. Helping them to get through a period of persecution is big. Giving them an understanding of basic, for lack of a better term, basic requirements of believers, right? Especially in the last couple of chapters, and in chapter 5 in particular, he admonishes them on very specific things that are important for believers in any age, right? To love one another, to not be lazy and disruptive, right? To encourage one another, right? To encourage the disheartened, help the weak, right? Be patient with everyone. In other words, he's showing them proper disciplines as believers, and all that is great advice for us in our day. So as we read through these books, especially the writings of Paul, we can see very practical advice is what I'm getting at, right? depending on the particular writings that the epistles in particular, some of them are oriented either in part or in full to doctrine, right? What in the Christian world would be referred to as theology. I'm not crazy about the word of theology for certain etymological reasons, but that's what I'm talking about, doctrine, right? The doctrine of salvation, the doctrine of grace, whatever it may be. But doctrine is not the only thing that you have to be concerned about when you're studying these books. You're looking at doctrine, but you're also looking at practicality, right? And really they go hand in hand. But in order to understand what we do practically, you have to understand the foundation of doctrine. So you have a little bit of doctrine in here in 1 Thessalonians, but for the most part, it's just a lot of practical teaching. You compare that, let's say, to something like the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is 6 chapters, and it's pretty evenly divided. So the first 3 chapters of Ephesians is very much doctrinal in nature, with teaching you about what your position is in Messiah. In other words, where we stand in the Messiah. And then the last 3 chapters it shifts gears, and it goes very heavily into practicality. What do we do as believers? So in the first 3 chapters is doctrine. What should we know about Messiah, right? What should we know about our faith? And then the last 3 chapters shift gears and goes into what should we do about our faith? How should we live our faith? Well, with 1 Thessalonians, it's pretty much, for the most part, oriented almost exclusively on the practical aspects. So it gives a little bit of historical context here. And for some of that, we're going to go looking in the book of Acts in a few minutes. But most of what's written here is meant to encourage, to admonish, to direct them to engage in disciplines that are going to keep them strong as believers. And these are all things that we can pull from the letter in our day so that we also can be encouraged. We're not going through the same persecution that they went through per se, right? But we go through things similar to that. When we find ourselves more and more having to defend our faith in the midst of a generation that holds biblical things at very low esteem, in that sense, we are also going through a certain type of persecution, right? So it takes a different flavor, obviously, in the 21st century than it did in the 2nd century, but it's still important for us to understand what, not the 2nd century, 1st century, because they were living in 51 Common Era. So we're talking about, thousands of years later, and yet there's nothing new under the sun, right? So the things that we see that are written, as the scriptures say, written for our example, right? So we learn these things historically, but we also glean the same teachings that are going to be important for us in our day, because some things just do not change for us, right? Some things are meant for us to also glean lessons from them. So by learning what those lessons meant for the early believers, then we're able to also learn what it means for present day believers as well, okay? Parents worry a lot about their children, right? And so do pastors. Speaking as a parent, I can tell you that no matter how old your children are, there has not been and never will be a time in which you will cease to have concerns over their well-being. Only the circumstances and the expectations change given their age at any given time, right? But not the worry. That doesn't change. The concern doesn't change. Are they eating okay? Are they getting enough rest? Are they safe? Are they behaving well? Are they giving importance to spiritual matters? Right? All of these questions and more flood the minds of mothers and fathers everywhere, as I'm sure those of you who are parents know, as they fret over the single most investment of their lives, their very own flesh and blood, their heart of hearts, as it should be. Did you know, though, that it's much the same for pastors, for ministers? At least it is for those who truly have the heart of a pastor. You fret over the same types of questions about your spiritual children. Are they safe? Are they getting enough to eat, both temporally and spiritually? You look at a time like in which we're living, and that's certainly true. I can tell you that elders have been meeting at least every 2 weeks to find out how the flock's doing everywhere and to talk about, different strategies to be able to make sure that everyone's taken care of. You worry about things like that. Are they thinking about, are they behaving themselves? Are they thinking about spiritual things and giving spiritual things the importance that they deserve. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit that I felt that in all my years of ministry. But in the same manner that I experienced moments of frustration, worry, impatience, mixed with happiness and joy, right, that I do with my flesh and blood children, I also experience the same things on a different level with ministerial things. So I understand completely, that's my point, I understand completely when I read this first letter by the Apostle Paul to the Thessalonians in the first century Common Era. You know, nothing much changes. Like I said, there's nothing new under the sun. So you can, for example, you can hear the relief in Paul's voice as he expresses thanks to Almighty Yahweh upon learning of the welfare of the young Thessalonian assembly that he had to leave behind in a moment of fierce persecution. You know, he had to run. He literally had to flee in order to escape persecution. And it's ironic that, you know, here he is trying to encourage the Thessalonians in their own persecution, and yet he had to flee from persecution to be able to be in a position to do that. So to better understand this remarkable letter, we'll take a moment and go back to the beginning. And you might call this study 1 Thessalonians, a letter of thanks, encouragement, and hope. 1 Thessalonians, a letter of thanks, encouragement, and hope. So let's turn to Acts 17 for some background information to better understand Thessalonians. Acts 17. And we'll begin reading with verse 1. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and this is in Greece, of course, they came to Thessalonica. And this is actually in what would be considered northern Greece. It's Macedonia. So when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. So there's a synagogue there, so you know that there are Jewish believers in Thessalonica. Interestingly enough, though, it's believed by most scholars that the letter to the Thessalonians was written to a predominantly Gentile audience. He says, verse 3, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. So he's reasoning 3 Sabbath days. And notice that. Don't let that be lost. Just a quick aside. Paul is in the synagogue, and he's reasoning with them on what day? On the Sabbath day, right? And that's very clear. Even this is, I'm using a New International Version, which is, you know, which is a good middle of the road translation. It's not too far to the left in terms of, you know, dynamic equivalence or rather leaning towards, dynamic equivalence, and not too far to the right in terms of slavishness to, you know, the literalness of the text. It's kind of in between. And it says quite clearly with a capital S, Sabbath days, so it recognizes the actual weekly Sabbath. So he's in the synagogue on 3 Sabbath days. So my point there is that if we have reached a point, and we're talking now, scholars are agreed, we're talking here about roughly 50 Common Era or so. So if that's the case, we're talking about, I would say, how many years after the Messiah had died? We're talking about 20 years after, right? So if you think that by this time, right, decades later, that they would no longer have to keep the Sabbath, right? Why didn't he just say, hey, let's meet on a Sunday and let's worship on Sunday? Well, he didn't do that. 3 Sabbath days, okay, maybe on the first Sabbath, right, he would say, okay, we no longer have to meet on the Sabbath. Maybe he did the first Sabbath because, okay, that's when everyone was going to meet. But then why didn't he say, okay, hey, how about next week we meet on Sunday or some other day, right? He didn't. He met on successive Sabbath days because that's when they worship. Anyway, he reasoned with them for 3 Sabbath days from the scriptures, 3 weeks, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Yahshua I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. So undoubtedly, he's sharing verses with them that are messianic, considered messianic verses, teaching them Isaiah and Jeremiah and a whole host of other scriptures that he could go to. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of Elohim-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. So these Elohim-fearing Greeks that you see oftentimes in the New Testament, these are likely the predominant makeup of the Thessalonian assembly. But other Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. And the marketplace would be the place where a lot of the administration and transactions were done. You oftentimes had in the marketplace, you had a section which was for administrative, legal cases, that kind of thing, because it was the common place where people would meet. So they rounded up a bunch of people from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. This is something that Paul typically experienced in his journeys. They rushed to Jason's house. Apparently, that's where Paul was staying. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. By the way, who was Silas? Well, Silas was Paul's companion after Barnabas left him. So back in Acts, just hold your place there in Acts 17. Back in Acts 13, just look at 12, verse 25. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. Okay, and then you see throughout chapter 13, described the first missionary journey of Paul, and Barnabas was Paul's companion during that mission. But when they returned to Antioch, which is where they were, they had a headquarters there. They were about to go on their second mission, and essentially they had a fight. Chapter 15, verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of Yahweh and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, who was his cousin. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such sharp disagreement that they parted company. So even believers have disagreements, right? It's going to happen. It's called being human, right? So anyone who thinks that believers will never have any disagreements has never read the book of Acts, right? Because Paul and Barnabas were about as close as they come, and yet they had a sharp disagreement, right? Such a sharp disagreement that basically they said, okay, you go your way, I'll go my way, and yeah, we'll continue to, essentially cooperating with one another, but we're not going to do it together. So it happens. Barnabas took, and they made up later, presumably, but it happens. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas, okay, and like I said, his name was Silvanus, Silas for short. He chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of Yahweh. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the assemblies. Okay? And then Timothy, in chapter 16, that's where they met Timothy, and then he joins Paul and Silas, and then they go to Macedonia, where they go to Philippi. Okay, so this is on the second missionary journey. They go to Philippi, which is in Macedonia, in northern Greece, and then after Philippi, they go on to Thessalonica, and that's where, or Thessalonica, and that's where we are right now. So down in verse 5 of chapter 17, they rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, this is the Jewish believers who were not believers, but they weren't believers, but they were Jews who were listening, they were observers, but they certainly weren't believing. And when they did not find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "Those men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house." They had heard about trouble that they had in Philippi. Remember that they were jailed at Philippi. So those men, of course, this exaggeration, right, to make things worse than they actually had been. These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. See, they're instigators. They're all defying, listen to this, they're all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there's another king, one called Yahshua. That's not a good accusation to make against someone, right? They're basically, accusing them of treason, right? When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Okay, so, there are some people who I've met in my journey, in my spiritual journey, who, they want to show a lot of bravado when it comes to being, worshipers. And, I'll face this and I'll face that, and, and I'll go against the devil and blah, blah, blah. You need to stop that, right? Sometimes you need to know when it's time to, you need to know when it's time to stand and do battle, and when it's time to go, right? There's a thing called prudence, and believers have to have it, right? So you got to do things with understanding, with peace. And here it is, Paul and Silas, right? They could have stood their ground, but they weren't trying to prove something to the point of getting stoned to death, right? That would not serve anybody. So as soon as it was night, they were sent away. Paul and Silas sent them away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue, because they would typically go to the Jews first, and then they would, talk to the Gentiles as well. Now, the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. So they had a different spirit than the Jews in Thessalonica, right? As a result, many of them, the ones in Berea, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. Look at this in verse 13. When the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of Elohim at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. And they were so spiteful, and they had such a heart against Paul and Silas and against this message, that they literally followed them miles. I mean, it's not I don't know exactly what the distance is, but it's not a short walk from Thessalonica to Berea, I promise you that. And they followed him to Berea. The believers, and when they found out, and by the way, let me just keep reading. Some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up, right? This instigation. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast. Once again, prudence, right? They immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. So Paul was the one they were really after, right? So somehow maybe Silas and Timothy were not as recognizable as Paul. So they had Silas and Timothy stay at Berea, but they immediately got Paul out of town, right? Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens, and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. And then we see throughout the rest, we won't read it, but throughout the rest of chapter 17, Paul is speaking to the men at Athens. And then in chapter 18, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, okay? And then down in verse 5, when Silas and Corinth is deeper into, like, central to southern Greece. And then when Paul, in verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Yahshua was the Messiah. Okay, so at some point, Silas rejoins him, and then Timothy joins him. And then we're going to learn from Paul, we did when we read it, that he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica because he had just started this brand new assembly at Thessalonica, and he knew that people were agitating against them and persecuting them. And you see the character of these men who were persecuting them, right? Because they were so fervent against the faith that they literally followed Paul to Berea. And Paul knows that if they're doing that to him, what must they be doing to this new fledgling assembly in Thessalonica? So he was worried. He was worried about them. So he sends Timothy, who's a young buck, he sends him and says, go find out what's happening and then report back to us. And that's kind of the context of everything that we're seeing here in 1 Thessalonians. Okay. By the way, at the time when Paul and Silas would have visited, Thessalonica would have been the capital of the Macedonian province. Macedonia was a province. I don't think I want to. Maybe next week I'll show you a map and show you a little bit more about that. Thessalonica, Philippi was also a chief city. It's referred to as a chief city, but it wasn't the capital. But both Philippi and Thessalonica were both important centers for trade, for commerce, for politics. They were both modeled after Rome. And because of that, they had a lot of prominence. Thessalonica, as I said, was the capital of the province of Macedonia. It had a population between 100,000 to 200,000. So it wasn't very big. To give you some sense, well, yeah, you wouldn't have any clue of this, but I live in Pennsylvania in a county that has about 200,000 people. That's what we have. So just my county is 200,000 people. So all of Thessalonica is about that big population-wise. So it wasn't very big, but it was by a harbor. It was by the water, and it was a natural harbor. So it was important because it's situated along major trade routes. So why do I always bring that information out about, this one being near a trade route and this one being right? Because all the places where these assemblies were established were typically areas of high interaction, right? Why is that important to know that? Is it just because I want to throw out useless facts? No, because it's important for you to realize that these assemblies were established in places where you had large interactions with people, because that was the point, right? The point was to get the message out there, to spread the good news, to spread the evangel, the gospel. And that's how they did it. They did it by establishing assemblies in major metropolitan areas, right? That had, people coming for trade, that had people coming for the arts in some places, for, theater and things of that nature, much like today, right? We have major cities. So if you wanted to establish an assembly, by comparison today, I mean, you could do it, in Podunk, Pennsylvania, or you could do it in Philadelphia, right? Where you're going to have the most impact. Clearly, you're going to have the most impact in a place like Philadelphia, right? So that's how they were in that day too. They were very strategic in how they set up these assemblies. And of course, it made sense because there were already populations established there, right? So you could get, and particularly synagogues established, right? And then you had, from there, you start the synagogue and then you branch out from there. So Thessalonica was situated along a major trade route, along the east to west Via Egnatia, Egnatia, which is a very important north to south trade route. So it provided an excellent opportunity to witness, right? Because trade gave access to masses, and religion and philosophy was prominent. So you had contact with all types, and you were able to get the message out to all types. And it was a free city. It was allowed great autonomy by Rome. It had local rulers that were known as politarchs, Politarchs, politarchs. And it was a city, just like Philippi, it was a city that was extremely loyal to Rome. So because of that, they could worship and administer as they saw fit. So they had a lot of freedom to teach. For example, Paul was not going to be prohibited from teaching there, but in the same way that he had that freedom, regrettably, everyone else did too, right? So, religion was replete with all kinds of paganism, right? So Greco-Roman pantheons and the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor. Also Egyptian cults had a big presence there. So it was, in a way it was bad, in a way it was good. It was bad because obviously there was a very high degree of idolatry and a lot of paganism, but it was also good because you need to get the message out to everybody, right? So it's ripe to witness and to present the faith, which is not unlike our day, right? In our day, pretty much anything and everything goes. So it provides a good opportunity for us to witness. Of course, in Thessalonica, there was a large Jewish presence, as we see from the text, and that would play a very important role in Paul's ministry. I'm going to turn to Acts 16 for just a minute. Just previous to what we read here, when they started in Macedonia. So Acts 16, beginning with verse 6, this was the beginning of the ministry in Macedonia. Paul and his companions, this is Acts 16, verse 6. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, which are in the area of Asia Minor, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. Okay, so they had been, Phrygia and Galatia are kind of, down, very deeply south in Asia Minor, but they were not allowed, Paul and Silas and Timothy, well, not Timothy, Timothy by this point, they were not allowed to go into the main parts of Asia Minor, that would be places like Ephesus, for example. And that Ephesus was the big one in Asia Minor. They weren't allowed to go there yet. And I believe the reason for that is because they weren't ready yet. There was too much groundwork that had to be established before they could touch a place like Ephesus, because Ephesus was like the granddaddy of witnessing in that part of the world. And they simply weren't ready for that yet. They hadn't had enough, sometimes, and that's a lesson for us too, right? If I were giving a sermon, I would point out that sometimes we have plans and we think that Yahweh delays those plans because he doesn't want us to do certain things. And it's not necessarily so. It's just sometimes we're not ready, right? Sometimes the time is not right, and more time has to elapse before you can do that. It's like anyone who is an artist of any sort, or creative, maybe a better term, of any sort, sometimes they want to leap before they can run, right? I know one writer, for example, who it took him 30 years to sell his first novel. Now, that may be, the exception rather than the rule, but that's a lesson in and of itself. If he had had that success early on, first of all, it would have been doubtful that he could have had it because he couldn't write that well 30 years prior. But even if he had had it, would he have been able to handle that success that early on? You don't know, right? So sometimes it takes you decades in order to get something. So, sometimes you're just not ready. And, someone out there has said that Yahweh's delays are not necessarily Yahweh's denials, right? And that's a good thing to keep in mind. Yahweh's delays are not necessarily his denials. He just may be denying you from doing something then because there's something better or more important waiting for you down the line. So just something to think about. So verse 7 of Acts 16, when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia. I could show you all this in a map, but the spirit of Yahshua would not allow them to. So essentially, Yahweh completely shut the door to Asia Minor. And by the way, notice that they tried, right? It's not like they didn't hear an audible voice. They didn't hear. So you can try things, right? But always leave room for Yahweh saying no, right? If doors are closing, that's another lesson for us. If the doors are not opening, then it's probably because Yahweh doesn't want you to do that right now, right? That could be for a job, or maybe a relationship that you're engaged in, or maybe you want to move somewhere and somehow it's just not working for you. You keep making offers on the house and it doesn't go through, right? And on we can go. I remember I can point to many examples in my walk, in my life with my wife, where we thought that we were going to be doing a particular thing and it just didn't work out that way. And at the time, of course, we were disappointed and, things were delayed, but it all went on to work out to be better things. Look, I could tell you that when we first came to Pennsylvania, we had plans for me to go and study, in Bible seminary type environment, and it was it was difficult for us. It was sacrifice because we lived at the time in Washington D.C. and for a time I had to travel from Pennsylvania to D.C. I did that for about 2 years. That was brutal, and if I had continued to do that, I probably wouldn't be alive today. So things kind of fell apart after a while, and we had to do things little by little. We had, I won't go to all the details, but we had bought a little mobile home here, and we thought, okay, we'll be here for a while in a mobile home. And before short order, we lost it, and we wound up moving to a house in Pennsylvania. I wound up leaving my job eventually because it was just too much. But before that, we moved to a place where it was an old house, and we could step with one step, we could step from our living room to the kitchen, right? And it was just, there were all kinds of issues with that place. And it would have been very easy for us to get discouraged. And we were certainly to a certain degree discouraged at that time, right? But, it was necessary. There were several reasons that I won't go into why, looking back, it was necessary for us to be there at that time. And I got to tell you, the truth of the matter is, I personally, looking back, I hated every second of being there. Certainly I always was blessed to have my family. I didn't hate being with my family, but being in that place and living that style of life that we had to live there, I hated every second of it, okay? And people will come to me and say, hey, is this better than what you had before? I said, no, it isn't, but it was necessary. And looking back, it's clearer now than it was even back then. And little by little, we were able to move on to other things, and things got better. And then today we're in a much, much different situation, like night and day as compared to back then, on several levels. Okay, life has changed, almost 180 degrees, right? Did I get the math right? 180, right? Okay. I always want to say 360, and that'll just take me right back to where I started, right? So the point is that you think at the time when you're actually going through that thing, you think, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to me? And this can't be happening, and nothing's working. Sometimes that's just the way it has to be, because you have to ask yourself, what is Yahweh trying to teach me right now? When Paul and his companions, they try different things. Let's go this way. Nope. Let's go this way. Nope. Let's go nope. Until finally they got the message, right? And they stopped trying. So at some point you have to stop striving, and you have to realize, okay, I don't think Yahweh wants me to go in this direction. What does he want me to do? And then you have to be receptive and sensitive to what it is that he's calling you to do, and respond. And when he opens that door, even if there's uncertainty, you got to walk through the door, right? Especially if there's uncertainty, you got to walk through the door, not recklessly, right? You still make plans, and you do what you can to mitigate whatever risk you're going to take, but you got to walk through the door, because he knows what's on the other side. He knows the end from the beginning. So, verse 9, during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. Some people think that may have been Luke. We'll never know. Who knows, right? Because Luke was, more than likely, Luke was a physician in Philippi. There's some internal evidence of that. So, come over to Macedonia and help us. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once. Notice that. You see, look for words like that whenever you're reading the text, right? Never, remember, there's nothing in the text that's in there whenever you're studying. There's never anything in there that's just by coincidence. Look for words like immediately. Like if you look in the book of Mark, everything is immediately, right? And immediately this, straightway, immediately, right? It's a thing of action. It's a book of action. It's very lean, the book of Mark, right? As compared to Matthew, that's a little bit more expansive, because it goes into all these parables and all that, or the book of John, which is something different animal altogether, right? But the book of Mark, very lean. And when you look at those things, it gives you clues as to how you should interpret the text. So you look at this here, right? At once we went to leave. In other words, once they knew that it wasn't Yahweh's will for them to go in this direction into Asia Minor, at once they went to Macedonia when they saw this vision, right? Concluding, this is the reason why they went at once. Concluding that Yahweh had called us to preach the gospel to them, right? So once they figured, hey, this isn't going to happen for Asia Minor, right? But we got this vision, we got to conclude that that's what Yahweh wants us to do. And then boom, at once they went. And then it goes on, describes what they did at Philippi, etc. Okay? And then Thessalonica will follow closely on the heels of Philippi. But the area was ripe for evangelism, is my point in bringing this up. The man from Macedonia was saying, come and help us. We need you, right? Yeah, the need was in Ephesus too, but it wasn't the time yet. But it was in Macedonia. They were ripe for evangelism. See, it's when Yahweh determines it is time, and not a moment too soon or too late, right? It's precisely when Yahweh determines it's time that something's going to happen. And by the way, notice what they were greeted with. If you keep reading, we won't go into it, but if you keep reading, you know the account because you've read through the book of Acts before. You see that they were greeted with open arms? No. They were greeted with persecution. How about that? No matter. Even in the midst of persecution, Yahweh would glorify himself. And it's no different today. How did the assembly begin to even grow? I don't want to go into a whole sermon here, but in Acts chapter 8, it talks about how it grew, right? Just very quickly. In Acts chapter 8, it starts off in verse 1, and Saul approved of their killing him. Killing who? Killing Stephen, who had just delivered a message. On that day, the day that Stephen was killed, what a way to start an expansion of ministry. What a way to start what would become the greatest expansion of the faith, that the world had ever seen. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the assembly in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. All except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. What an auspicious beginning, right? So was it great, preaching and great this and great that that expanded the assembly early on? No, it was great persecution. They were literally scattered throughout the known world. And that scattering is what Yahweh used to spread the message everywhere, right? He left the apostles untouched in Jerusalem, but everyone else was scattered everywhere. Just the book of Acts is one of my absolute favorite things to read because there's so much going on there, and especially the story of Paul. But anyway, so going back to Acts 16, so persecution is what started that assembly in Philippi. And by the way, that was the first assembly in Europe, was Philippi, followed by Thessalonica and Berea, etc. Okay, around, like I said, around 50, 51, Common Era, and then Paul would later spend about 18 months at Corinth. You saw in chapter 17 that Paul and Silas were chased out of Thessalonica and Berea, and then Paul goes on to Athens, but he sends Timothy to follow up on the status of the Thessalonians. He goes to Athens, and then later they go to Corinth, and then they're all together at Corinth, and then Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and then they send Timothy to Thessalonica to find out, because he's very concerned about them, right? Because he had to leave too soon. And he has these corrupt Jewish non-believers who are defaming him to the people. They're passing him off, and you get this sense from Thessalonians, they're passing him off as one of the religious or philosophical charlatans. Remember that Thessalonica is filled with religious people of all kinds of persuasion. So they're making him out, they're instigating the crowds, basically saying this guy's a charlatan and you shouldn't be listening to him. They're claiming that he's greedy and that he's exploiting them. They're just lying and slandering him, right? And that was what was happening to Thessalonica. And they did not get to, Paul and Silas, they did not get to disciple them to the extent that Paul had wanted. So there were many unanswered questions. This is why he sends Timothy. And then eventually Timothy rejoins them at Corinth and he reports on their well-being. And that makes Paul very happy, and it gives him a big sense of relief. It's what occasions the letter to the Thessalonians, which Paul writes at Corinth, and then he sends it to them so that they could read it and be encouraged by it. There are several major themes throughout the letter, and I'm just going to give you a bunch of them, and then we'll go very quickly through chapter 1, and we'll be done. I don't think we'll get to chapter 2 today. So several major themes in the letter. One of them is that Paul is expressing approval and affirmation. He loves this group. They're new, they received him well, and he has their best interests at heart. And he's in grief because of the things that they're suffering in persecution. He wants to encourage them to continue to progress. He also wants to answer questions, to clarify misconceptions, because this is what you do with a new group, right? If you're dealing with new believers, you have a lot of questions, and you want to answer them, right? Especially questions about Yahshua's return. And then there were, in the interim, from the time that he had left them to the time that he found out more from Timothy about them. Remember, this is not like now that you just hop on a plane and you go somewhere, right? You're talking about months in between, because you're dealing with travel by ship. So by the time that he's hearing more about them, apparently a number of their members have died, and they're concerned about their opportunity for salvation. So that's why if you look at chapter 4, verse 13, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind, right? Or he says in the beginning of chapter 4, as for other matters, brothers and sisters, we instructed you how to live in order to please Yahweh, as in fact you are living, right? And we ask you and urge you in the Master Yahshua to do this more and more, for you know what instructions we gave you by the authority of the Master Yahshua. So he had given them some instructions, some discipling, but they didn't get to do as much as they had wanted to. He says in chapter, let's see here. like chapter 2, verse 18, for example. For we wanted to come to you, certainly I, Paul, did again and again, but Satan blocked our way. And then somewhere else, it escapes me at the moment, but somewhere else it says that we had wanted to come to finish the work that we were doing, right? We had wanted to come with you to you and give you more information and answer your questions and all that. Okay, so that was part of the reason why the letter is written as well. It's written to reassure them of their hope of salvation. It's also written to affirm his leadership and to dispel the naysayers and the critics, these wayward Jews that were causing him all kinds of grief and who were slandering him. So he wanted to reaffirm his credibility, right? So that's another reason why he writes. He wants to urge them to holy living. This is the practical aspects of it, right? He wants to urge them to holy living in anticipation of Yahshua's return. In other words, he wants to urge them towards sanctification, which means living in such a way that you're seeking holiness, that you're trying to live separate from the world, and living in a way not separate physically, obviously, but separate in thinking, right? Transforming the mind instead of conforming to the world. So if you go over to Romans chapter 12, which I quote very often because to me it's like a foundational text for us. Romans 12, verse 1, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, right? He did it in Rome too, in view of Yahweh's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to Yahweh. This is your true and proper worship. What is a sacrifice? A sacrifice, how does the sacrifice take effect? A sacrifice implies what? A sacrifice implies a death, right? So if you're a living sacrifice, it's kind of almost an oxymoron, right? But it's just a metaphor. You're being sacrificed. In other words, you're dying to yourself, and instead you're living to Yahweh. How do you do this? Verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Your mind has to become renewed. You have to start thinking like Yahweh. You have to start thinking like your Messiah. We are disciples. He is our master. We have to follow the expert model, right? Yahshua is the expert model, how he lived, what he taught, his values, his mission, his objectives, his outcomes are what we should also follow. I just heard in a message today the difference between conforming and transforming, right? Conforming, the pattern of the world, right, is conforming. It's coming from the outside to us, right? We're taking the things that we see in the world and we are being influenced by them and becoming like the world. But transformation is different. Transformation begins on the inside. Yahweh works with us from the inside out. The world works on us from the outside in, but Yahweh works on us from the inside out. And from the inside out is the way that we have to do it, beginning with the mind, with the heart, right? Beginning with Yahweh's word penetrating our minds and hearts and transforming the way we think, right? Something that is transformed changes from one thing to another. Transformation, right? Trans across. Like transportation, you're being moved from one place to another, right? Transatlantic, across the Atlantic. Transformation, formation across, right? From something, from what? From one way of thinking to another way of thinking. Transformation. So you think of conformation. If you conform to something, what does it mean for someone to be conformed? It means you kind of adopt the shape of that thing, right? If I say I'm conforming too much to the world, what does it mean? It means that I'm becoming accustomed to living in the same way that this secular world presents. So I start thinking in the way that the world does things. I think with the mind of Babylon, right? Where everything is about economics, where everything is about how much money I can make, and success is determined by material things, etc., right? And that's just one way I could describe it. But in relationships are not necessarily based on the spiritual concepts that Yahweh contains within his word. Relationships, in business, in the personal realm, are oftentimes based on what I can get rather than what I can give, right? And I don't want to be too harsh because, I don't want to paint an inaccurate or unfair picture. But the reality ultimately is this. For us, Our job is to become more like Yahshua, not more like the surroundings in wherever we find ourselves, right? It's that internal transformation that has to take hold in us, which means that we have to transform our thinking. We have to begin thinking like our master and act that way, right? So this is what Paul is teaching to the Thessalonians as well. He wants to urge them to holy living in anticipation of Yahshua's return. What does that mean in practicality? What does that look like? It means that we think differently about sex, right? Sexual purity. It means we love one another in a way that's demonstrated by action, right? We encourage. How many times, like I said, does he say throughout the book, encourage one another? We're supposed to not just be looking towards the self and what can I get, but we're trying to help one another, right? This is why during this crisis of the coronavirus, we've been having these meetings, because part of it has been to encourage one another, to know we're not alone, that we're thinking of one another, right? To encourage one another, to love one another. He also tells them to lead a quiet life. You know, at one point he says to mind their own business, right? To lead quiet lives. In other words, don't be always involved in the order of the day. Right? That's why I'm not, you know, personally, I'm not really heavily involved in, you know, in a lot of, you know, things dealing with, you know, I don't know. I try not to get too involved in things that are not my business, I guess is what I'm saying. But I think that we have to be careful how we do that, right? Because people interpret things differently. For example, some people say that you should never ever, as a believer, should never ever get involved in politics, right? Whether it's local or otherwise. I don't necessarily believe that, right? I think that that's really a personal decision. I think that, you know, I know believers, prominent ones among us, that are most definitely involved in political things in a political office in their respective communities. And I think that that's valuable, right? Because you're representing the interests of your people, whereas they may not be represented, right? So I think that that's important. But I think that in some cases you can take that too far, right? So I think always, like everything else, you have to have a balance of that, okay? You know, you look in the scriptures, what do you do with a Daniel or a Joseph? You might say, well, they were thrust into that. Doesn't matter, they still did it. You have many situations where there are people who are involved in their communities, right? So you got to be careful not to go to any extreme on those things. But the leading a quiet life is speaking more to just not being a troublemaker, right? Not being always in other people's business, not being, you know, not being, in our day, you might say, well, you know, are you getting involved in all the little, you know, tit for tat things on social media and all that? There's no need for us to be involved in that. You know, I mean, enjoy social media, you know, do what you can to be part of community, even online, but, you know, watch out how you do that, because that tit for tat stuff, that's not for us. And on I could go. So lead a quiet life, a life where you live respectably, where you show people, right? Where you show people that you're a person, you're a serious-minded person who has higher level priorities than what oftentimes serves as, you know, important in our society in the day-to-day. So there are some things that are just not worth our time and effort, and we have to be careful not to go down that road. Industriousness, right? You know, he says that you don't want people to be lazy, just be lounging around. We should always be working. Work was created by Yahweh. People think sometimes that work is, sometimes people give the impression that, yeah, that work is a curse, because they look at Genesis and they say, well, see what happened with Adam and Eve, and he was cursed to work the ground. Well, the curse wasn't working the ground. He was working the ground before the curse was given. Work was created by Yahweh. We were made to be workers. We were made to be caretakers of the land, right? What was the curse? The curse was the fact that things became more thorn than thistle, and work became almost unbearable in terms of trying to get, you know, as much yield from double the work, right? That's where the curse comes into play. But work itself is not a curse. Work was a blessing. Work is how we engage in the image of Yahweh. He's a creator, and so are we. That's work, right? So be industrious, right? He's urging obedience to scriptural authority. He's also urging them to rejoice. He's urging them to pray, because we can't do this on our own, right? He's urging them to be grateful, to always have gratitude, right? Gratitude is the antidote to so much of the things that we suffer in our day. He's urging them to to accept and be open to the truth. He's urging them to study carefully so that no one pulls the wool over their eyes, right? He's urging them to abstain from evil. These are all things that you find in this letter. And these are all fantastic pieces of advice for us as well, right? Let's go very quickly through chapter 1, and then we'll be done. Paul, Silas, and Timothy to the assembly of the Thessalonians in Yahweh the Father and the Master, Yahshua Messiah. So we already know who Paul, Silas, and Timothy are. We know that they're addressing this to the assembly at Thessalonica, and that's happening. It was being written from Corinth. We're not told that here, but historically we know it was written from Corinth around 50 or 51 Common Era. We always thank Elohim for all of you and continually mention you in our prayers. We remember before our Elohim and Father your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Master Yahshua Messiah. And by the way, this was preached to the Thessalonians, but of course, by extension to us in our day, because Yahweh put these things in there for our example. We learn by hearing the word, it says in Romans, and this is how we grow in our faith. By learning what was important to them in their day, we learn what's important to us in our day. And notice these verses here, whatever they do leads to concrete action and hope. So the word is translated into action, right? The word in and of itself is not meant to be just empty, right? The word is meant to produce something. So he thanks Yahweh, and he mentions them. He's always praying for them. So we should always be in prayer for one another, right? But we also remember before Yahweh, our Elohim and Father, your work produced by faith. So notice that work produces faith, right? So if we continue to do these things, the kind of things I was just describing, the kind of behaviors that we engage in as believers, it builds our faith, right? No matter what's happening around us, as long as we continue to do the things that Yahweh has told us to do in his word, as long as we continue to follow the example of our master and do the things that he told us, right? It produces faith. Your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love. So the labor that we do, that work that we do, is not just a selfish type of thing, right? It's produced, prompted by the love that we have towards Yahweh, the love that we have towards one another. And it's also supported by endurance or steadfastness. What produces the endurance and steadfastness? What inspires being steadfast and having that endurance? Isn't it inspired by hope in our Master Yahshua Messiah? If we believe in something that awaits us that's greater than the things that we're seeing in the world today, I don't know how we could do this if we didn't believe that there was hope in the future, my friends. Look, he makes a big deal in 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection, right? Why is it so important to make a big deal about the resurrection? Why do we cover the resurrection every year in a special way during the wave sheaf service? Well, we cover it because we have to keep reminding ourselves that the things that we see before us today are not it. It's not the end, right? If the things that we suffer in this world today because of living in a fallen world, a few weeks ago, some of you may have been present for the session that in which I gave a message about suffering and things that we deal with in this world. If the things that we see in the day to day, if the plagues that we're experiencing and the crime and the violence and all the things and persecution that we endure from time to time and other things, if that was all we had to look forward to, what would all be for, right? But what helps us to have hope, what helps us to remain steadfast and to have endurance is because we believe in our hearts that there's something greater. We believe that there's a resurrection, that death is not the end, right? And we believe that even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of things that we deal with in this world, we could still have joy because joy is an internal condition that's predicated upon our faith and upon love, right? Our love for one another, but our love also for Yahshua the Messiah, right? So all these things that motivated them, the Thessalonians in their day, also motivate us in our day. It all results from a conviction, a full conviction in our hearts of the good news, a belief in that evangel, right? For we know, brothers and sisters, we know, right? It's a certainty. We know, brothers and sisters, loved by Yahweh, that he has chosen you, right? So we know that we're loved by Yahweh. We know that he has chosen us because our gospel, our good news, came to you not simply with words, because words are, by themselves don't take effect necessarily, not simply with words, but also with power. In other words, they didn't just talk a game, right? The things that they spoke, there was substance to those things. There was power behind those words, right? It's like, the question that I often ask that I got from the Truth Project, right? Do you truly, is it truly believe, or do you believe that what you, no, that's not the way it goes. Do you believe that what you say you believe, okay, I always get that messed up.
Do you believe that what you believe is really real?
Do you believe that what you believe is really real? Do you believe, really, do you believe that what you believe is really real? The answer to that question makes all the difference in the world. Because I know people, and you probably know people, that say that they're believers, but their actions and their words say something else. Now, I'm not throwing that out there as an accusation. I'm throwing that out there as an observed reality. There are some people that say that they believe, but their actions or their words convey something else. And I'll take it a step further. There are days when my actions for myself convey a message that I don't really believe. And if you want to condemn me for that, that's fine. You're made of different stuff than I am. There are days, and it depends on the day, where I question if what I really believe is really real. Because if I didn't feel that way, if I had all the conviction in my heart that what I believe, what I say I believe is really real, I would never act in certain ways, and I would never say certain things that I say on any given day. And I'm just being totally genuine with you, because that's my human condition. Now, I try very hard to believe what I believe is really real, right? Because in my heart of hearts, whatever that means, I do believe it. Or else I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today. Just wouldn't make any sense to do that, right? I would just hang it all up and say, well, it was a good run, but it's time to move on to other things, right? Well, otherwise, why would I waste my time? It's like I often think about the apostles. I say, that most of those guys, most of those disciples, and I'm not just talking about the 12, but I'm talking about records of all kinds of disciples. You know that most of those people died martyrs, deaths, some of them brutally. Right? The only one that I know of that died a natural death of the original 12 was John. That history says that he died, in exile on the island of Patmos, or maybe he came back from Patmos. I don't remember exactly, but they said that he died a natural death, and pretty much everyone else, at least tradition says, right? We don't know for sure, but at least tradition says that this one was hung on a cross upside down. This one was, stoned to death. This one lived to this, right? James was thrown off the highest point of the temple and clubbed to death. They died horrible deaths. And I'm thinking to myself, why would anyone subject themselves to something like that if they didn't truly believe that what they believe is really real? It would be incomprehensible. That to me, and maybe my burden of proof, and I'm on a bit of a rant here, but it's relevant. For me, it's like, that's proof for me, right? It's like, why would anyone subject themselves to the persecution that they did if they didn't truly believe in that? It's a big thing for me to see that in history. And this is the kind of faith that I aspire to, right? I want to believe with such certainty that I get to the point where I'm willing to lay it all on the line for this faith. And I don't know if I'm there yet. How about you? For we know, brothers and sisters, loved by Yahweh, that he has chosen you, because our gospel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit and deep conviction. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about deep conviction, right? You know how we lived among you for your sake, so he's giving proof. You became imitators of us. Right? It's always nice when you can have someone imitate you. It's quite flattering, right? And they'll imitate you if you're living a life that's worthy of that imitation, right? You became imitators of us and of the Master, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. And notice that it's the Holy Spirit that gives joy. Joy is that internal condition. It gives hope, right? So we see that, and let me just keep reading. Verse 7, and so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia, the province of Macedonia, and Achaia, which is southern Greece. That's Corinth, Athens, etc. Yahweh's message rang out from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in Yahweh has become known everywhere. You see, it's contagious. That faith and example is contagious. So Paul and Silas were examples, and Timothy, they were examples to them in how they lived. And in turn, so they imitated them, and in turn, they became examples to everyone else. You see, that's how that works. It spreads. If it comes from sincerity and authenticity, it spreads. So they were imitating them, then they became an example. It's a progression, right? And then finishing off those words, therefore we do not need to say anything about it, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us. They tell how you turned to Yahweh from idols to serve the living and true Elohim. In other words, the witness spoke for itself, right? People saw evidence. Do people see evidence in us, in our day today, about us being believers? Or do we blend so much into everything that we do that people don't know, right? And, I'm not talking about, wearing different types of clothes necessarily, right? But I'm not talking about walking around and wearing all black or all white or, doing something with a uniform. What I'm talking about is, but I am talking about modesty in clothing, right? Am I talking about, isolating ourselves from people everywhere and never going to a movie or never going to this? As I was growing up, I heard some of that stuff, right? You can never go to a movie, you can't wear pants, and you can't, if you're a woman, and you can't do this, you can't do that. All these can'ts that have nothing to do with this, right? But instead, there's a modicum, there's a way to be different without being excessive. So yeah, we can go to movies. Yes, we can watch TV. Yes, we can listen to songs. But what is it that we're watching? What do we allow to go across our eyes? What do we visit on the internet? And on I could go. What do we listen to? What do we consume? See, we have to think differently. Remember, we're not conforming to the patterns of this world, right? But instead we're transforming. Are we doing enough of that transformation, you see? Those are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Because when we do that, people will see that and they'll say, there's a different way to live. These guys are believers. Now, in our day and age, it's becoming less and less fashionable and less impressive to people, but make no mistake about it. There's still people who respect that. And you can't worry about the ones who don't. And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Yahshua, who rescues us from the coming wrath. So there's a progression of spiritual maturity that Paul is describing in this first chapter. The student imitates the mentor. The Thessalonians imitate the mentor, and then the students themselves become the mentor and example to others. And this is what we should be aspiring to, right? And there's a description here of conversion, true conversion, right? True conversion leads to a change of heart, transformation from the inside out. What did they do? They turned from idols. What did they do? They didn't just turn from idols, but they completed the cycle and turned to Yahweh to serve him. It's not enough just to turn away from the idols, right? You got to turn towards something. So you got away from something that's good. That's a good start. But now what are you doing with that? Well, you're turning towards something else, You're going from the false to the true. You're going from the inauthentic and disingenuous to the genuine. And ultimately, it's all about waiting for his son in faith, knowing that it's Yahshua who ultimately rescues us from the coming wrath. Okay, that's the first chapter. So Yahweh willing, we'll continue with that next week. But I think that we will stop there. Before we conclude with prayer, is there anything that I can review or clarify? Does anyone have a question or a comment on this study? And if not, we'll just close with prayer. Going once. Going twice. Okay, great. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for staying with me. It's amazing how quickly 90 minutes goes by. May Yahweh bless you. Father willing, we will do it again next week. And let me just check one thing here. Make sure that there's nothing going on here. Oh, thank you so much, Emma. Appreciate that. Okay, just bear with me a second, okay? Oh, and by the way, today completes 4 weeks, believe it or not, 28 days towards the Feast of Weeks. So remember to count. So next week we should be good for 5 o'clock, and we'll take it from there. All right. Oh, you're welcome, Charlotte. Thank you. Can I ask Richard to close with prayer, please?